changed. Everything keeps changing. Oh, they keep updating
The computer.
updating the
How dare they?
looking for where to change the view, which used oh, there it is. Great. And here we are on speaker view. Okay. So Genesis chapter 1, and we are beginning with verse where is it? Yes, verse 10, verse 27, chapter 1, verse 27. If you're using the Eitz Chaim Chumash, we're at the top of page 10. And now God having created through the first days of creation, 5.5, right? I mean, 6.5, I'm sorry, through 6.5 days of creation, basically has created everything in the world, and actually the universe, one would say, the sun, the moon, the stars, the earth, the heavens, all of the sentient life, except for human beings. And as I mentioned last time, this gives rise to an old midrash about how human beings were created at the end, which can be read in one of two ways, right? That we are the crown of creation, or that, even the ant was created before we were, right? That we're almost an afterthought. And this should teach us both to be proud of who we are and a little bit humble as well. So now God is about to create human beings. And it says, actually, I'm sorry, I want to start a little bit further back.
And go get it, man.
Page 9, verse 26. And God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. And this is a little bit different because there's a kind of up to this point, God says, let there be light, there's light, right? God says, let the waters bring forth swarms. And there's no reflection about the nature of these things that God is bringing forth through speech into the world. We're not given any description of them, except maybe that they're fruitful. The trees and the animals are able to reproduce themselves. But here we see something about these things, this being, which is in God's image, after God's likeness, right? So it is Kidmutenu, I'm sorry, Bid Salmenu, Kidmutenu. So what's striking about this is, first of all, what does it mean to be in the image of God? We'll come to that in a minute. But the other is, let us. let us. So who is the us? Up to this point, God has been speaking and the world's come into being. And this almost looks like, a team. And it almost looks like God is saying, let's make people, or let's make human beings. In this case, it says man, but it's really humankind, who is like us. So who's God talking to? And a number of answers has been given. By the way, if you're a Christian, this is easy. This is the three aspects of God, right? The Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit is all unified in one. So when God says, let us, meaning all the aspects of the divine, right? And this is an example of one, and there are many places where we could say, we often say, well, we and the Christians share the same Bible. We call it the Hebrew Bible, they call it the Old Testament, but it's not exactly true. I mean, it's true when you come to things like love your neighbor as yourself and a whole host of other things, but it's not really true when we begin to look at how we understand and interpret things, right? So to give you one famous example, not from the Torah, right? The Christians read a line in Isaiah to say that a virgin will give birth. And we read the same line to say a young woman will give birth, which I think is a more accurate reading of the Hebrew, but what they're doing is a kind of midrash, right? But we have the same text. It's just that our understanding of it is so different that in some ways it's not the same way, though in most respects it is. So that's their way of reading this. Another way you could read this is kind of the royal we, when the king or the king queen speaks, we are not pleased, right? The we is really me, I, but it's called the plural of majesty. Somewhat unlikely because we don't see God talking that way very much. Now you could say, well, the word Elohim itself, the name that's used for God here, is a kind of plural form, but in other respects, the verbs that agree with it are always singular and not plural. So we really come down to a sense that there is some kind of beings that God is conferring with. Let's do this. It's good, let's do it. And those are, and the Bible certainly considers such beings to exist. We often call them angels, right? A divine court. If God is a king, the king has a court. These are perhaps lesser beings, not human, not quite divine. They're divine with a smaller d, created by God, controlled by God, right? But nonetheless in existence. And we can see that these beings actually can be sent into the world to do God's bidding. So very famously, three beings who come to Abraham when he's sitting in the tent, and it turns out that they are angels, and they look like people. Doesn't quite recognize them as such. One of my favorite scenes is right before the Battle of Jericho. This being appears to Joshua, and he sees him and he says, "Are you with us or against us?" Right? Friend or foe? And the being says, "No." No, right? No, I'm not either. In fact, I am the champion of God's army. And so this is a kind of military figure that's part of the divine retinue. And he is there to deliver strategic advice to Joshua. And that's how Joshua presumably knows that they'll march around the city 7 times, they'll blow shofar, the walls will come down. Right? So some kind of angelic beings. Now, this leads to some tremendous midrash, as the rabbis say, God says, let us make human beings in our image, and they say, bad idea. You really shouldn't do this. It's not good, because they're just, they're going to be sinful, and you're not going to be happy, and they're not going to be truthful. And God says, nonetheless, I'm going to do it. God feels this is important to do. And then we'll have stories later on where the angels kind of oppose human beings. Moses goes up on Mount Sinai to receive Torah, and according to the Midrash, they don't want him to get it. Right? So we have this kind of opposition. Here, it's the Midrash, this is a very apt Midrash, this idea, let's not make human beings. right? Because they'll be evil, you'll destroy them. And God says no. And we have here a sense of God's mercy overcoming God's justice, right? God will not destroy them. We'll see something close to it in the story of the flood, and we'll get to that. But God will not destroy them. God will be merciful. And of course, that's a wonderful text as we come into the high holiday season. And we realize that we are somewhat like what the angels in that midrash predicted we would be, and we ask God to show us mercy. So one more thing about this verse, and then I will open it up for questions. What does it mean that we are in God's image? Does that mean we look like God? Right? And that would be in some ways a simple reading of the text. And so and we do have in the Torah itself a great deal of anthropomorphic language. Right? We're going to see in a verse or two that doesn't really work here. So I want to suggest, what does it mean to make human beings in God's image? It means human beings can do the things that God does, and particularly here in the first 6.5 days of Genesis, God can create, and so we too create. God names, God separates, God blesses, God acknowledges good. All of those qualities, which are the qualities that we see demonstrated by God so far, are indeed qualities that the human beings are allowed to have. And you could take it a step further. It would seem from chapter 2 that we were also, if we want to read the two chapters together, which I'm not sure you can, but if we do, we were also meant to be immortal. Because in chapter 2, we lose that. And we'll see that shortly. So God says, let us make human beings in our image, after our likeness. I'm going to stop there just to open it up to any questions on what is essentially one verse that we have looked at so far. Any questions? Sandy, go ahead, then Myra.
So I have the Hertz edition, and it says here as about letting us make God, let us, says the use of the plural, let us make man, is the Hebrew idiomatic way of expressing deliberation. And then it also refers to at the Tower of Babel, this is Genesis 11, verse 7, come, let us go down, and there we found their language.
Right. So yes, and I think the Midrash is picking up on that idea of deliberation when it suggests that God is consulting or conferring or deliberating together with the angels, and in fact, there's a dialogue between them. Right. This is the very fact that God doesn't just say, "Let there be human beings." It suggests some kind of deliberative process. And then there was Myra. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is how do you equate the Big Bang Theory with God? The first day did this, second day did this.
Good.
How are they equating this?
Okay. So what do we do with modern science and its sense of the history of the universe, the Big Bang, all of that? Give me till chapter 2, and I'll come back.
Okay.
It's a great question. It's one we all struggle with. Anything else before we go one more verse or two? Go ahead, Sandy.
I'm sorry. Did someone else have their hand up?
I don't think so. Not
Okay,
yet.
all right. I seem to remember years ago when you were at B'nai Tikva that you said this, and maybe I got it wrong, that God was lonely, so God wanted to make man
Yes,
to praise him and see all the wonders of the world.
right. Certainly a possibility.
Yeah.
Uh, and we see, I think we see this more clearly actually also in chapter 2, where we get this idea. It's not good for man to be alone, right? There's sense that there needs to be some kind of companionship, that God who exists solely in the universe needs it. There's another possibility, and we're going to see it right now in the next verse, and which we'll also see somewhat in the second chapter. So let me go on. What is what is it that these people will do? They will rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle of the earth, all the creeping things that creep on the earth. Right? So that's our job. Our job, rule is an odd word. The Hebrew here is v'yirdu. They shall, oversee, preserve, control. There's a lot there, but the idea is God created the world, God created human beings to the world becomes our domain. You could say it's androcentric, right? It's our place. This suggests that we pretty much can do whatever we want with it. And the Midrash jumps against this very strongly. And it says, a very famous passage, see all that I have given you, how beautiful it is. Don't destroy it, because if you do, there will be no way of replacing it. A kind of ecological model. Don't take this so far. And then we get the actual creation. And God created man. I'm going to read it as man. Et ha'adam, the man, in God's image, in the image of God, he created him, male and female.
Oops.
Right? So on the one hand, we have the sense of man, but this man is both male and female, right? That to be in God's image, that both men and women are, in some sense, in God's image. There is a sense here of simultaneity, that when God creates human beings, men and women are created at the same time. And both men and women have the same role, which is overlordship, stewardship over creation, right? So, somebody had a question?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Is there any mention in this creation of the fact that there may have been a first creation before ours with Lilith?
Okay. So I'll talk about Lilith when we come later on to the story of actually Adam and Eve, which is where it becomes, sort of interesting, and where the rabbis speculate about this other woman. Okay, so then God speaks to these creatures that God has mastered and says, be fruitful and increase, fill the earth, master it, rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, all living things that creep on earth, right? So we, like the animals, are to multiply. The world is there for us to fill up. And God says, see, I give you every seed-bearing plant that is upon the earth, every tree that has seed-bearing fruit. They will be yours for food. and all the animals on land, to all the birds of the sky, and to everything that creeps on earth, in which there is the breath of life. I give the green plants for food, and it was so. So, who gets to eat animals? Nobody. Right? God in creation, at this moment, human beings, these beings that God has created, are created as vegetarians. Right? There is no sense that animal life, when God says, I give you this to eat, right? There's no sense that animals are among the things that God gives us to eat. And we'll have to wait quite a while until the story of Noah, where we see it. Right? Human beings will be given the right to eat meat, but only in certain ways and under certain circumstances. Okay, and now we see God saw all that God had made and found it very good. Tov ma'od, right? This is the first time that we get this adjective, very good. It's like creation is complete, right? And it's very good. God is enormously pleased, one gets a sense. The world is good. That's not going to last too long, I have to say. And there is this sense of, in the Torah as a whole, there is this sense of order, which then goes into disorder. Here, God has created order, very orderly process, 7 days, certain things each day, kind of unrolls. And at the moment, it's perfectly orderly. At the beginning of the book of Numbers, we see a description and a census of the people, and then a description of the camp where the various tribes are settled, encamped around the center, which is where the tabernacle is, containing the tablets that Moses brought down, the sense where Moses can go meet God. It's beautiful, it's symmetrical, each tribe has a flag, it's absolutely orderly. And then the rest of the book of Deuteronomy, things fall apart. Rebellions and problems, right? And I think that is a sense, we talk about that the world goes that way. And then we have to have a restoration of order. Okay, so we have 6 days, and now it says, and this is a passage that you doubtless know well. It's part of the Kiddush. It's part of the davening, right? But I do want to point out one thing in the Hebrew text. The last 2 words of chapter 1, Yom HaShishi, and the first 2 words of chapter 2, Vayehulu HaShamayim. Look at the first letters of each word. Yom, Yud, Hashishi, He, Vayehulu Vav, Hashamayim He. Yud, He, Vav, He. The 4-letter name of God. And there is a sense in which I think you could say, having created the universe, God now signs. God is the artist who signs God's work in a way. I don't know that that's intentional. It's quite striking. Remember also that the divisions into chapters and verses are much, much later. So this is meant to be a kind of continuous narrative. And now we have a sense that they are finished, right? Also, one other thing I'll mention, when you make Kiddush on Friday night, you have this paragraph right before Kiddush, and some people begin, instead of Vayehulu Hashamayim, Yom HaShishi. Vayachulu Hashamayim, right? Not the whole previous verse, just the last two words, so that we do get that Yud, He, Vav, He at the beginning of this paragraph. Okay, so it's the 6th day is over. Everything has been completed. Vayachal Elohim b'yom hashvi'i malachto asher asa. And on the 7th day, God finished or had finished all the work that God had done. The malacha. Malacha is an important word because it is the word that's used for what is forbidden on Shabbat. Malacha means creative work. Obviously, God does not, it's not sweating here. It's not about effort, right? It is creative. But the word Vayachal could mean finished, or it could mean worth on the 7th day God finished, meaning what? The finishing of the work is on the 7th day. That is, there's an element of the 7th day that finishes the work. In other words, God is not done creating in the first 6 days. We're going to have something else created on the 7th day. What's created here isn't work, it's the absence of work, right? We're going to get Shabbat now, and it begins Vayishbot Bayom Hashvi'i, right? God ceased. And if you look in Hebrew, if you have the Hebrew text, we're in verse 2, Yishbot, Shabbat is the root of Yishbot, right? God rests. What does it mean that God rests? It's a very odd question if you think about it. On the 7th day, Mikol Malachto, of all that creative work that Asher Asa, that God had done, and now V'yivarech Elohim et Yom HaShvi'i, God blesses the 7th day, V'yikadesh oto, and hallows it. Before we had human beings being blessed. Here it's a day of the week. And God, the Hebrew word to hallow, yikadesh, is rooted in separation. So this is the 7th day, but it is separate and therefore different from all the days that preceded it. Mikol Malachto Asher bara Elohim, all the work of creation that God had done. Right? So, and then it goes on, Eila Toldot Hashemayim Va'aretz. This is the story of heaven and earth, Bihi Baram, when they were created. Okay, so I'm going to stop here once more for questions, if there are any, now that we've got human beings on this stage. We're about to go on to another chapter and another story of creation. Francesca, go ahead.
So when we talk about God created us in his image, and then we also talk about emulating, about ceasing from work and creation, that was the thing I was thinking about. That since God rests on this day of Sabbath, we should as well.
Yes, I think that's true. And just to take it a step further, this, of course, becomes, for us, of course, the most central Jewish holiday. And part of its centrality is the only holiday that we share with God, right? In other words, we think about Pesach or Sukkot or Shavuot. Those are all about the Jewish people and what happened to the Jewish people and our experience. Right? This is an experience that, we observe Shabbat, God observes Shabbat, right? There is, and it gives you a sense of how singularly important Shabbat is. We'll see the same thing play out in the 10 Commandments. There is no other holiday that seems important enough to make it in to those 10 Commandments, but there's Shabbat, and really centrally in the Ten Commandments. So the idea that it is inherent in creation itself puts it in a completely different category. And one more thing I'd say about this, if you look at the Hebrew names of the days of the week, right, how do we name them in Hebrew? Not Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Yom Rishon, Yom Sheni, Yom Shlishi, Yom, right? First day, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day. Not Yom Shvi'i, but Shabbat. Right? In the Hebrew language, we don't call it the seventh day. And why? Because God separated it out. It's not the seventh. It's not like all the other days. Reminds me of Sesame Street. One of these things is not like the other, right? The seventh day, it's not like the other days. Good. Any other questions or comments before we go on? Saul.
Yeah, it's interesting. Nothing to do with the context, but it's interesting that the Sephardim in their services, you know, they do the whole creation in the first Aliyah. And the Ashkenazim, you know, they make they're up to the fourth Aliyah when you get to the second chapter. Interesting.
I did not know that.
This is in the Hertz. The Hertz shows you the
That is
quadrants.
interesting. And is that true in other places in the Torah where there?
Yes, there are other places. There are other parshiot. I just don't know which ones. Yes.
Wow. Thank you for that, because I did not know it, and it's interesting. Go ahead, Sandy.
So, continuing what Francesca said about, you know, making us in God's image, I heard a program on JBS where a rabbi was saying the 13 attributes of God, you know, Adonai, Adonai,
Right.
where he lists all the patience and forgiving, are really things, I hadn't thought of it that way, but things that we should be doing. These attributes, in the sense of God's image, we're doing the same.
Right,
We
that's
should
very
do that.
nice. Sure, since they are the divine attributes, right? Moses says to God, I want to know you. And
Right.
God passes before Moses, which is still in this high holidays theme. Thank you very much. And we see God is compassionate and so on. Very nice. Good. Well, I'm learning a lot from you today. Thank you. We're going to move on to the second day of creation. And just change the view again. Okay. So the line that I just read, such as the story of the heaven and the earth when they were created, is really kind of transitional to what we get now for the rest of chapter 2, or in this case, according to the Ashkenazic division, the second Aliyah, right? And what we see here is a very different story. One that really cannot be squared with the first one. If we're going to look at this as sort of, this is what happened, here we have a history of what happened to create the world, and so this was made on one day, and this was made on another, and another, and another. That was chapter 1. Chapter 2, we're going to see very significant differences. And that really brings me back to the question I think Myra asked, how do we square this with science? The answer is, I don't think we can, but I don't think we have to. Because if we have two accounts of creation, which are inconsistent with each other, it's really not possible to say about this that this is a description of the origin of the universe, the earth, human beings. It tells us something essential about the earth and our relationship to the earth and our relationship to other human beings and our relationship to God. But I don't think it's history, and I don't think we were intended to read it that way. Now, I just said that, but there are certainly medieval authorities who want to somehow square this circle. And they will, attempt to show why the first first chapter is kind of general, and the second chapter gives you details and things like that, but I really don't think it's tenable, at least as I see it. Okay, so let's see this second story of creation. So we get to, on the day when, the Hebrew literally is on the day, but when the Lord made heaven and earth, when there was no shrub of the field and on earth, and no grasses of the field had yet sprouted. Why? Because God had not sent rain upon the earth, and there was no human being to till the soil. So we don't have any description of the separation of waters or anything like that. And it says not that God said, let there be vegetation, but here we have a sense of a kind of natural process where you need rain to bring that vegetation into being. And you need human beings who have the responsibility in order to cultivate it, to till the soil. Where was the water? There was a flow that would well up from the ground and water the surface of the earth. Right? So now we don't have a separation between heaven and earth, and then the seas and land. We now have water welling up and covering the earth. And in that situation, now we get human beings being created. Right? And we get Adonai Elohim, translated here as the Lord God, but it's not Adonai, right? That's the word we use as a euphemism for God, the Lord, literally, right? But Yud He Vav He, which is here, is God's four-letter name. So this is very different, even in terms of how this individual who creates the world is named. In chapter 1, it was just Elohim. Here it is Adonai Elohim, Yud He Vav He Elohim. And God, Vayitzer, God forms, creates. You know what the Hebrew word for a potter is? It's a yotzer, right? We have that. There are other words as well, but that's that thing we say on Yom Kippur evening. It's part of Kol Nidre, that we are like clays in the hands of the yotzer. So God is forming us. And how does God create human beings? From the dust of the earth, very much like a potter, right? And then God blows into this human being's nostril, nishmat chayim, God's breath of life, and that becomes now that Adam is a living being. This is so different from God's let there be. In chapter 1, God's hands off. we don't see God's not in the nitty-gritty of forming things, right? And here also, we're going to see, unlike chapter 1, where we have this sense men and women are formed at the same time through speech, here we get a guy, clearly a guy, who later on, from him, we will find that there is a woman also. We'll come to that creation of women soon enough. My point here, and I just want to emphasize it again, you can't square these two traditions. They're really, really different. Okay, so what does God do then? God plants a garden. Right? You're not talking about hands-on, right? And if you like gardening, you should know that you're in some sense doing what God did here. And what is that God? It is in a specific place. It's a gan, a garden, ba'Eden, in Eden, in this place. So there is a place, and there God plants a garden. And where is it? Where is Eden? Mikedem, to the east. So there's an east and a west. And what does God do? He is V'yasem Sham et Adam Asher Yatzar. God places that man which God had formed into it. And now, after human beings are created, and there, guess what grows? And from the ground, the Lord God caused to grow every tree that was pleasant to the sight and good for food, and the tree of life in the middle of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and bad, right? So there's Eitz Chaim, and then there is Eitz Hadat, the tree of knowledge of good and bad, right? So there are two named trees. We have a sense that they're much more significant than others. We'll see more about them, and then we have all the trees in the garden. Okay. And then more about this garden. We have a river that comes from Eden to water the garden, and it separates, becomes 4 branches, and we have the name of them, right? Pishon, Havilah, and that is the Pishon winds through the whole land of Havilah, where the gold is. The gold of that land is good, and Bdellium is there, and Lapis Lazuli is there. And then we have the second river, which is the Gihon, that winds through the land of Cush. And the third is the Tigris that flows through Ashur. And the fourth is the Euphrates. Right? So we get now this primordial welling up, being separated out. And we actually see the names of some familiar rivers here. The Tigris and the Euphrates. We have a sense of where we are in the Mediterranean. And now God takes that human being that God had made and put it in the garden. And what is his role there? La'avda u'lashamra. Has 2 things that he is to do. La'avda is to work it. L'shamra, to tend it. And the tend in the sense of guard. Shomer, the Shamra, right? In other words, he is to use it, to work it, and also to protect it, to make sure that that bad things don't happen to it. So I like this verse very much, because I think you can see in this verse kind of a reflection of our relationship to the earth. I said a few minutes ago that what we have here is not history, but I think it is about human beings, our place in the universe, our relationship to the world. It'll be soon when there are other people, our relationship to each other. That's what this book is about. And here, we're not only told to be fruitful and multiply, and we're not told that we can dominate creation. We're told that we have 2 roles. One is that we're entitled to work the land, but our dominion is limited because we are also protectors. We're stewards. That's the word I was looking for. We are stewards. We have a stewardship responsibility over the earth. So you have here a kind of entire ecological view of our relationship to the planet, and its 2 roles, and they need to be kept, one would assume, in balance with each other. We can't despoil the earth on the one hand, and yet we need things from the earth, and we are entitled to take them. Right? So it's I think, an enormously important verse, and it really speaks to what Genesis, at least in the creation stories, is about. Now, God now does something. Vaitsav, God commands. The first time we've seen God commanding here, And what is the nature of that command? The Lord God commands human beings, saying, Mikol etz hagan achol tochal, you may surely eat of all the fruit of the garden, but not of the tree of knowledge of good and bad. You must not eat it, because on the day that you eat it, you will die. Right? So we've lost the Eitz Chaim now. We're just talking about the Eitz Hadat, the tree of good, of knowledge, and specific knowledge of good and evil. God is saying, actually, you can eat everything, but you can't eat that. So here, we've already had Shabbat, and I would argue, now we have kashrut. It's a very specific, very limited kind of kashrut, but there are things you can eat, there are things you can't eat, and God is commanding that. Now, in some ways, you could argue this is a setup. This is making something absolutely irresistible. Tell someone they can't have something, and we're going to see with Adam and Eve that it becomes alluring, irresistible, and ultimately Eve and then Adam are going to succumb to it. Now, what does it mean that you will die? Here, it seems to say that day. When you do it, you'll die. The story, as you know, doesn't play out that way. Adam and Eve are going to be exiled and so on. They're not going to be struck dead.
Mhm.
And so, in fact, reading this retrospectively from there, it really means you'll be mortal. And this comes back, and now I'm reading chapter 1 in the context of chapter 2, but it really means that we have this sense here that human beings were meant to live forever, if you will. But because of this, they will not. They will perish eventually. Okay, and now we're going to get the creation of women. And it starts, again, this is the Lord God who says, Lo tov, it is not good for a human being to be alone. Eselo ezer kenegdo. So I will make an ezer kenegdo. So God is going to create something so that human beings are not going to be alone. And that something will have a particular role. So the words are ezer kenegdo. And you can translate them in a variety of different ways. I would read it the following. Ezer certainly means a helper, la'azor, to help someone. I would like to read it a little more broadly as a partner, rather than simply someone who aids. Kenegdo really means corresponding to him, like him, in some deep way. So I think, and beyond that, the idea of it's not good for him to be alone, not that it's too much work for him and he needs a helper, but that existentially he shouldn't be alone. And so I will create something like him to be there with it. Okay, so what does God do? Well, of course, he makes a woman. Not so fast. Not so fast. What happens? All right. So God forms out of the earth the wild beasts, the birds of the sky, and brought them to human beings to see what he would call them. And whatever he called them, that would be his name. And man gave names to all the cattle, the birds of the sky, all the wild beasts. But for him, there was no fitting helper found. Didn't work. God hoped that from all of these animals, this creation, something, one of them, one species, would be that corresponding helper.
Yeah.
Remember back in chapter 1, the animals were created before human beings. Here in chapter 2, we come first. And then the animals are created for a particular reason, but it does not work. This is God's first attempt, and it doesn't work. And so now we have to have a creation which will really correspond, in some sense, have the same image. And now God again gets God's hands dirty. And first of all, God places over or casts over the human being a tardema. A tardema is a very deep sleep. We're going to see it again with respect to Abraham, when the covenant is made with him. He also will go into this deep state. It is not sleep. He doesn't put him to sleep. Here we see the divine anesthetist, as God really is putting Adam under. And then what does God do? Man is now in a deep sleep. God takes one of his ribs, closes up the flesh, and God now fashions, literally builds from that rib that he has taken a woman, right? And he brings that Isha, that woman, to man, and he says to the man says, this one, this time, at last, right? This finally, this is the bone of my bones and the flesh of my flesh. And just as God had named the other animals, God here named, just as Adam had named the animals, Adam now names her Isha, right? Why Isha? Because she was taken from Ish, right? From man. And so we get this female form, Hebrew form of man. And then we get what is really, we are really out of time, but I'll finish this. I'll take your questions. We may run a little bit over. Okay. And then we get what is essentially an editorial comment, which is, a reflection on what we've seen. Okay, and therefore, Ya'azov ish et aviv et imo, a man leaves his father and his mother, v'davak bi'ishto, he clings to, almost sticks to his wife, v'hayu levasar echad, and they become one flesh. In other words, the two parts that were separated, this part of Adam, which has now been formed into another being, now gets returned, right? And together they become one flesh. And we also have this sense of joining, and joining, since there is no such thing as a sexless marriage. And indeed, if they are to be fruitful and multiply, we have this physical joining together. And therefore, we have a sense that it is right and proper for people to leave their childhood home, that we need to individuate and now have our own lives with a companion. One thing else I forgot to highlight before, he names her Isha because she comes from Ish. He is called Adam, because he comes from the earth, Adamah, right? God takes the earth, the dust of the earth, and forms him. Okay, having said that, I'm going to stop. Let me open up the view. Anyone who has anything they want to do, we'll just go until your questions are exhausted, which will be a few more minutes. And if anybody wants to leave earlier, that's fine too. Well, let me say this before I do. We will be now taking off till after the holidays. And then the first Tuesday after they are over, after Sukkot and Simchat Torah, we will resume, and I'll send out something to remind you. Okay, B.
Yes, you said that Adam named all the animals. Did he also name himself Ish?
That is an interesting question. Yeah. I'm just looking.
Same.
I'm looking back. Yeah, I don't see it.
Yeah, it didn't mention it, but
Yeah, that's really interesting.
yeah, he calls his wife or the woman Isha, so he must have named himself Ish.
But Ish seems to be his name, and it's not exactly clear where it comes from. That's really interesting. I'll look at that some more, see what I can find out about it. Thank you for that, Francesca.
So this last sentence in chapter 12, hence a man leaves his
I'm sorry.
chapter 2, sorry. Hence a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife. But if Adam, I know they're talking, I'm supposed to talking like more for the future, but supposedly Adam and Eve were the first ones, so they're not leaving anybody.
No.
What are they talking about?
This is the reflection of a later person who is, in a sense, narrating this story.
Okay.
Right. The Al-Kain is sort of hence it will be the case that.
Okay.
Right. It's not, and God commanded men to leave their parents, and right, it's in a different place.
Because the other part of that, thank you, is that if it says that he's making God as a helper, and we also talked about partner. So I'm wondering how he differentiates between the two, because helper suggests that woman is not at the same level as man.
Yes. And if you want to read it not as partner, but as helper, right, then we have essentially a fundamental distinction between chapter 1 and chapter 2.
How so?
Because in chapter 1, they are created at the same time and they are clearly equals. There's no sense of differentiation. She's not there to help him. He's not there to help her, right? That's the story in chapter 1. Story in chapter 2 is that he's there and now she's brought because he has a need. He's lonely, right? It's not good. Maybe also to help with the work. I don't see that as clearly, but possibly, right? So I want to say that what emerges, and I said before, this is about our relationship with each other. What emerges from, if you only had chapter 1, we have no sense of the interdependency of men and women, right? They're just in God's image. They're there. In chapter 2, we have a lovely story which says they are interdependent. But you could argue from chapter 2, she's only there because he needs her. That's why we need chapter 1, which tells us essentially that they're both in God's image and that one is not an afterthought to help the other or to fulfill an emptiness in the other. So if you want to say, why do we have these two stories which are so different? I would argue that one of the reasons we have them is because each one alone won't teach us certain essential things about the human condition.
So you don't see it as women being subservient to men. You don't read it that way.
I don't think you can read it that way if you also want to read chapter 1.
Oh, that's what I thought, but I just wanted the clarification from your understanding.
She's not there to help him with his work. She is there because otherwise he's incomplete.
Okay.
But that still means that he's primary and she's secondary.
Yeah.
She's there to fulfill something of his.
Mm.
And again, that's why I come back to chapter 1. I think you need both. I saw a number of hands. I think Saul, you had something?
Barry.
Is there
Go ahead,
any
go ahead,
reason,
Saul.
is there any reason why there's an interruption between sentence 18, Loto Hayot Ha'adam Levado, Solo Ezer Kenegdo, and then all of a sudden, it's, you know, he names the animals and everything, you know, and the plants and everything, and all of a sudden it picks up again in 22.
Yes, I think the reason is because the first attempt in the text for this being that's going to help Adam not be alone is the animals. In other words, God doesn't go right to actually carving a being out of Adam. The first step is the animals. And then, but Adam names them and looks at them, and there isn't found among them this being that will complement him. You know, dogs and cats are very nice, and for some people, the bonds are extremely deep, right? But there is a sense that the true completeness here has to be with a human partner. I saw, and Barry wanted to ask something. And
Yes, I'll offer another interpretation
sure.
that the pinnacle of creation up to this point was actually the Garden of Eden, and that man was created just as a servant to the garden, to tend it, and that man needed help, and woman was created. They were created as equal, both subservient to the garden.
Yeah.
I take these thoughts from Yuval Harari, a historian, author of *Sapiens*.
Yes.
Who looks at the broad brush of history, and almost, you know, views human beings as subservient to the fields in the genetic sense. The winners are these the grains that we farm.
It's very interesting. Yes. Thank you for that, Rob.
Yeah, I had a question about the animals. In chapter 2, are the animals all are there single animals, or are they created in pairs? In chapter 1, I think I'm not sure about that either, but it sort of speaks to if in chapter 2, God brings all the animals to Adam attempting to find a partner, then would that imply that each animal was also created individually and that there weren't, although.
Yeah, it's a really good question. We tend to read chapter 2 in terms of chapter 1. In chapter 1, they clearly have partners.
Right,
because God is telling them to be fruitful and multiply and so on. You can almost imagine in chapter 2 that these are single animals. God is naming that animal. And then, no, that's not the right one. Man is naming that animal. No, that's not the right one. The next one. It's really, I never thought of it that way. That's really interesting. I don't know if that's the case, but it's very provocative. That was Barry's comment. You guys are just rolling today, I'll tell you. Okay, Sandy.
So I read in Abby Pogrebin's book about It Takes Two to Torah that most people know the second story. Most people don't, that they remember it because it's a story. You know, there's a man and then out of the rib. So unfortunately, it's been used over the years to show man's being superior to women, and people can refer back to the Bible to that story.
Mm-hmm.
Just a comment.
I think there is a, there's to take it to an extreme. What does Shakespeare say? The devil quotes scripture to his own purpose. I think you cannot read these stories without each other, and if you do, right, it's going to lead you. But the other thing is that you can't also read them in a fundamentalist way, because there are two of them and they contradict each other. Right? So it's not really possible to say, well, it's written here in black and white. Or it was written in Hebrew, it's a different language, we're translating it. But even so, yeah, thank you for that. Any, yeah, B, go ahead.
Yeah, following what Robin said, I was thinking when you were talking about naming the animals, and they came 2 by 2, but it nowhere says that they were not sister and brother, and maybe taking a rib from Adam could be thought of as making a sister
Yes,
instead of a wife.
yes, okay. So I want to come back, we'll come back to this story of familial incests, because we also have to figure out, you know, eventually we're going to have Cain and Abel, and then Abel gets killed by Cain, and yet the world goes on. right, right. You know, like, who does he marry? How does this work? Right. So we'll come back to that when we look at that story. I think I'll talk about it more broadly. Okay. So yeah, Michael, you have to unmute. Yeah.
Just did. Yeah. You know, you were talking earlier about time sequences. God created the earth in 6 days, and science says it took millions of years. Eat off the tree, you will die that day, and yet it means you will die eventually. The way my rabbi back in yeshiva 1,000,000 years ago said that God's not construed with time. Well, our day is 24 hours, but a day to God could be 1,000,000 years. And that's how they explained it.
Yes, so you certainly can do that. And there is some basis for that in the fact that we don't get the creation of the sun, the moon, and the stars until the 4th day. And when we think about time, we do it in relationship to that, right? So what does it mean? You know, we say a year is the amount of time that we're talking about the sun, the earth going around the sun. Well, we don't have a sun, moon, stars, anything until later, and yet we're counting days.
Yeah.
Yes, you can look at it that way. I think you can harmonize the Big Bang by saying, well, look, light was created first, right? Light, energy, right? I think there are ways to do it. I just think they're very forced. And it doesn't really help me when I look at the differences between chapter 1 and chapter 2. It maybe gets me an old earth, but it really doesn't deal with issues of evolution, with, you know, a whole host of things that I don't really think can be squared with this biblical text. As much as perhaps we would like it to, I would go further. You know, if you look at the plagues, there are attempts to say, well, you know, wasn't supernatural, it was a sequence of things, and first we had a red tide, and that killed the frogs, and so on and so forth. But it really kind of breaks down towards the end when you have darkness in one part of the land and not in another, for the firstborn of some people dying and not others. I think these naturalistic scientific attempts to explain things don't really jive with the text itself. I think, is there somebody else who wanted to say something before we leave? Okay, so we're going to pick up now. We've got Adam and Eve in the garden. We know that they're not allowed to eat from one particular tree. And we'll have to wait a few weeks to see what happens. And how that leads to the rest of history as we know it. In the meantime, I want to say Shana Tova.
Shana Tova to you, everyone.
Shana Tova.
A really joyous Sukkot, which is Man Simchatenu. It's the time of our greatest joy and everything else. And see you right after the holidays. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye.
Bye.